Hi, my name is Lexi Matthews, and I'll be doing the Meeting the Needs of Deaf or Hard of Hearing Students. Before we begin, I'd just like to say that most, or if not all, of these facts are based off of deaf or hard of hearing children in hearing schools, not in deaf schools. And so it's important that we meet the needs of students who are deaf or hard of hearing to increase the percent of students who attend college, because currently it is only at 4%. And every 3 out of 100 students experience deaf gain, which is the acquiring of deafness or becoming hard of hearing. It's usually known as hearing loss, but the deaf community likes to refer to it as deaf gain because they are proud of being deaf. So it's not really a loss of hearing, it's a gain of being deaf. And these students may not make it. Currently, statistics say that they won't ever excel past a 3rd or 4th grade reading or math level because of unknown reasons, but in reality it's because we don't necessarily put them in a position to fail, but we don't really give them the correct support to succeed as well as they should. For example, we don't let them show their knowledge in ASL, or we don't try to teach them ASL so they have their own tools to learn the material. Instead, they're trying to learn English while they are also learning new context or content information. These are the 4 main areas that being deaf or hard of hearing impacts for children in hearing schools. It's the delay in development speech and language. Delays in speech and language then affect academic success, the language barrier that causes social isolation and poor self-image in students, and sometimes it even affects the students' belief in their own abilities later in life, such as career choices. So for speech and language, it's kind of controversial among the deaf community whether a child will choose to speak or not, or choose to learn sign language or speak English. This really comes from where the child's background, the parent's background, are they deaf, are they hearing, do they have a cochlear implant, do they not. It's really just a decision that's made in the home, and when they get into your classroom, you just have to go with it. Another thing is that some parents don't choose to teach their child how to speak, so when they get into your classroom, you will be required to sometimes teach them how to speak, which is really hard because they can't sound out words like hearing children, so they have trouble learning English that way. And if the teacher doesn't know how to sign or learn how to sign basic words, sometimes there's like a huge language barrier that occurs between the student and the teacher, because the teacher is asking the student to learn English and the student needs the teacher to learn ASL, and they both don't have a means of communication, and so a lot of instruction gets lost in between that barrier. Then for academic success, again, the 3rd, 4th grade level, because we don't give them the tools to learn, and so they're kind of stuck trying to learn multiple things at once, and it's just really hard, and it's just not really fair to ask them to do that in English and not give them the choice of doing it in ASL. And also sometimes they don't receive the support from home that they need, and so that can be a real challenge. Social emotional, because of these language barriers, students who are deaf or hard of hearing have trouble connecting with hearing peers or socializing with them, and they're also have a huge the society also tends to see being deaf or hard of hearing as a huge loss instead of a gain. Like I said earlier, the deaf community views hearing loss as deaf gain, and society doesn't really explain it like that, so students have a hard time coping with being deaf when they're not in the deaf community. They see it as they're different and that they don't fit in, when in reality they're just not in the right community for them, which is also known as autism, who is oppressing those who are deaf or hard of hearing, because in schools they're often forced to learn English or forced to speak to communicate with their peers and with their teaching, which is actually very damaging at a young age, because they're learned that their own community and their own language of American Sign Language is not what they should be using, which isn't correct or true. So that also can relate sometimes into students starting to assume that they'll never be able to do certain careers because of the lack of support and opportunities in the hearing community that they have received. So for teaching strategies, one of them is just learning basic signs in American Sign Language, or taking classes and even becoming fluent if you're really passionate about it, but teachers are not expected to learn ASL when they have a student who is deaf or hard of hearing in the classroom. And another technique that people will use is using ASL that they do know, or ASL that they find online, or even asking the deaf student to teach ASL as much as possible to promote inclusiveness and acceptance in the classroom. And it's also important to keep in mind that ASL may be the only language or first language for your deaf student when they enter the classroom, and it's important to just respect that, and as you would any other language. Another technique is teaching with an interpreter, and one of the main things to keep in mind when you have an interpreter in the classroom is to talk to the student directly and not to their interpreter, and also use first-person language, not third-person. So talk to the student like they're there, not like they're not in the classroom. Because while you're not expected to know sign language, you are expected to acknowledge the student. You also should talk at a normal pace around the interpreter, because you don't need to slow down for them to interpret. They can keep up with you. However, you should take breaks during lessons, because interpreters can get cramps in their hands, similar to carpal tunnel, and will not be able to sign for a bit. So if you take breaks, it allows the interpreter to just get a minute to relax. You also should make the room light enough so the student can see the interpreter's hands. Make sure the student is seated in the front where they can see both you and the interpreter at the same time. And let the interpreter stand wherever in the classroom they feel is best for their student, which is generally going to be in the front with you. So the third teaching strategy is your classroom setup, which a typical deaf student classroom will be set up in a U shape or a semicircle so that every student can see each other signing, which is something you can also do in a small classroom with your hearing students, so that the student can see their lips, their facial expressions, as well as see you and the instruction going on. But if you have a large classroom, you should just try and place your deaf student in the front so that they can see you, the interpreter, and they can turn around and see all their peers as well. It's also recommended that you try to stay out of the projection, like lights or window glares from the sun, so that the student can read your lips and see your facial expressions when you're giving instruction, because if they can't see your face, then they can't understand what you're saying. Also, you should point to what you are talking about on the board when you're talking, so that the student knows exactly what you're referring to, so they don't get lost during instruction. And another big thing to remember is that you should never talk while the students are reading, because your deaf or hard of hearing student will not be able to see that you're talking and will miss that instruction. So a couple sources that I put up for extra reading or extra information that you can refer back to if you end up teaching in a classroom with a deaf or hard of hearing student is the Make a Difference PDF, American Speech Language Hearing Association, and the Gate Communications websites. The Make a Difference PDF is really about is really for teachers who want to learn more about teaching strategies and the do's and don'ts about interpreters in the classroom setup, and just other techniques, which is really nice. The American Speech Language Hearing Association provides links to hearing screenings, information, and support to people with deaf gain. And the gay communities provide taboo questions people get asked, just some fun facts about the deaf community, the links to interpreters, interpreter classes, and other supports for teachers who may be teaching deaf students or who even want to go into teaching a deaf classroom, which is only for deaf students or hard of hearing students. All right, and that is the end of my PowerPoint. Have a great day.